The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, roughly 4.5 years. In it, 600,000 plus men lost their lives. Of course, a majority of that was to disease, and another large chunk due to battlefield casualties, but there was a smaller percentage of casualties happening in between those epic clashes like Gettysburg or Chancellorsville, Antietam, and so on. There were, throughout the entire war, about 500 men, both North and South, killed by military execution, 2/3 of which were carried out because of desertion charges. In the 1861 Confederate Articles of War, the document reads that, quote, all officers and soldiers who have received pay or have been duty enlisted in the services of the Confederate States and shall be convicted of having deserted the same shall suffer death or such other punishment as, by sentence of a court-martial, shall be inflicted. And it's seen in actually both Confederate and Union Articles of War that desertion has no clear definition. It's up to the officer presiding of a unit or regiment and so on to decide the definition of desertion on a case-by-case basis. For an example, one such case being that of Private William C. Doughty of the 1st U.S. Volunteers. See, one night, while sleeping on the steamship the Effie sailing up the Missouri River, Doughty decided to move the location of his sleeping quarters on the ship. His presiding officer had him charged, tried, and killed for desertion. Doughty hadn't even left the ship, just simply moved his sleeping quarters away from where his company actually was. And this, according to the captain of his unit, was cause enough for execution. Other studies have claimed that in the Union Army there were only 4 true deserters, as they call it. William H. Hill, William H. DeVoe, Adam Smaltz, and Adam William. There are a lot of Williams. In fact, the first Union soldier to be shot for desertion was named William H. Johnston, who was charged rather speedily for his crime. Why so many Williams? 4 men deserted while on garrison or picket duty, not in the line of action. So that is why many consider them to be the 4 true deserters of the Union Army. Of course, the Army made exceptions for these rules. These men didn't turn tail and run in battle. They were simply on garrison, as I mentioned. It was different when coming in the face of action, and men had a natural reaction to be afraid and ran away from the front lines, sort of like you see in the movie or read the book Red Badge of Courage. To a similar tune, desertion was viewed less as a heinous crime during the first 2 years of the war by officers in the Army, and public opinion could not stand the idea that volunteer soldiers were going to be executed for such things as petty as desertion. Even Abraham Lincoln himself said, "You can't order men shot by dozens or 20s. People won't stand for it." In fact, because of this unpopular idea of executing soldiers, in the first 2 years of the war, especially around 1862, a Union deserter might find himself under the punishment of being branded with the letter D, a capital D on his hip, to denote his crime, and then sentenced to do hard labor for a time. Other punishments were less cruel, simply being discharged and told to go home. On occasion, they would have a sentence in prison. On the Confederate front, as Union forces and campaigns plunged deep into the southern heartland of Virginia, many soldiers, especially Virginians, being so close to their homes, would desert the Army and head home. Most of the time, this was around harvest season or planting season when most of these desertions would happen. Confederate General James Longstreet suggested that out of 32,000 men under his command, perhaps only 7,000 had not taken leave by desertion. The first military executions in the Confederacy took place on August 19, 1862, when 5 men were shot and killed by firing squad under command of Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson had wrote that, quote, "The preservation of the Army itself was dependent on the maintenance of discipline, and discipline could not be had if deserters were longer to go unpunished." One Sam Watkins wrote of the Army of the Tennessee under Braxton Bragg that deserters were routinely shot without trial. Meanwhile, in 1863, court-martials in the Confederate Army were becoming a nearly daily routine. So the way these executions were carried out, especially by firing squad, were a big 3-sided square formed of those that were watching, mostly the soldiers, the fellow soldiers. And at the end of the 3-sided square, there was a number of poles for the accused. One author puts it particularly well when he writes, quote, "The convicted men faced with imminent death were frightened in this mortal fear, in many cases paralyzed their limbs. In this disordered state, they were paraded before their former comrades in arms, rigid at attention. The contrast was not lost on most witnesses. The apparent vulnerability of humanity was expressed graphically in action, not in words. The sight of a fellow soldier unable to stand erect with tears and saliva mingling on his face, being half carried, half dragged to his death, was designed to achieve maximum impact on all witnesses and underscore the complete and total power of military command over each and every member of the Army. Following this short parade, a military chaplain would come out and give them their final rites or their final prayer. The accused would be tied to those poles at the end of the square, often blindfolded and told to kneel in a coffin. Presently, a firing squad drew near and, upon command from their officer, killed the accused. The bodies of the deserters were left where they lay. This was so everyone who was watching could simply march past and take in the sight, and again, that maximum effective impact would be left on them, stained into their mind. Once everyone who was witness to it had seen the corpses, the bodies were put into the coffins face down. See, there was an old Christian tradition that those who were good Christians were buried face up, facing the heavens, and those who were sinners were buried face down in their coffins, denoting that they would be going to hell for their crimes. Unfortunately, not all executions went well. At the execution of 5 men once again for desertion, an eyewitness to the event wrote that he, quote, "looked towards the graves, but to our astonishment each man yet remained standing, showing conclusively that the detail had fired high. The second, a reserve detail, was at once marched into position, and at the same signal the smoke puffed from the carbines, and their fire proved more accurate, but not entirely effective. The prisoners all fell. 3 were dead, while 2 were trying hard to rise again, and one of them even got up upon his knees when a bullet from the revolver of the provost marshal sent him down. Again he attempted to rise, getting upon his elbow and raising his body nearly to sitting position, when a second bullet in the head from the marshal's revolver suddenly extinguished what life was left, and a third shot put out the life of the second prisoner." Of course, execution by firing squad was not always carried out for executions for desertion. Some men were hung for their crime. But because of the technical requirement involved in hanging, there was less pageantry and dramatic effect for these executions. Despite the lack of drama, there was, however, the presence of a slow burning tension. Prisoners were forced to watch as the gallows, their means of death and the site that they would die at, were slowly built and constructed before them. After the person was hung and pronounced dead, the body would remain there for a considerable amount of time. Some men would just watch, mesmerized by it. A limp, lifeless body gently swaying at the end of a taut rope in a summer breeze. One such hanging, infamously known as the Kinston hangings, which happened on a chilly February day in 1864. 13 former Confederates were lined up on the gallows, wearing sullied Union uniforms and corn sacks on their head. See, these men were deserters of a different kind. They didn't desert and just go home. They were defectors. They went straight into the Union ranks and were given uniforms and even guns. Unfortunately for them, they were captured by George Pickett of Gettysburg's fame with Pickett's charge. Whole Confederate brigades came to watch this hanging. Even the townsfolk of Kinston, North Carolina, stopped what they were doing to see these hangings. And in a quick fashion, the men swung. After they were hanged, the men were cut down, some of their bodies being left there for days. However, presently they were, some, stripped almost naked, as the hangmen demanded the uniforms as payment. But, as I said, the bodies remained there for days waiting to be claimed. So military executions during the Civil War are not happy occasions. No execution really is. But perhaps they can give us an insight on the minds of people in the 1860s, especially the minds of military commanders, both North and South, as they chose what they deemed fit. Fit punishments for deserters. Fit discipline for fear. Thanks for watching.